So I recently acquired a relatively obscure book that makes some implications that has got my mind, my imagination, my mental faculties of all kinds just completely fired up. And I have what I expect to be an extensive and time-consuming research project ahead. I have a couple other projects, extensive and time-consuming research projects that I'm trying to wrap up. But then I'll be diving into this one. But I just feel really compelled to talk about this because it's really fascinating stuff. And so the book in question, Letters from Russia in 1919, it's by P.D. Ouspensky. Now, those of you who are familiar with the Fourth Way and G.I. Gurdjieff will know that name instantly, but for those of you, I would like to say the book was published in 1978. It was published by Routeledge Kegan Paul Limited. The publisher is still in business. Now it's just called Routeledge. It's in the UK. But the letters were actually written in 1919, obviously as the title suggests. But for those who are not familiar with Ouspensky, Ouspensky was born in Moscow, in Russia, in 1878. He met G.I. Gurdjieff, who's he's one of the most prominent, influential, and important mystics, I guess would be the best way to describe him. He's one of the most significant mystics of the modern era, depending on what you consider the modern era. But he developed a system called the Fourth Way that has just the esoteric spiritual, esoteric Christian, esoteric community in general. Few people have had more impact than Gurdjieff. Ouspensky was kind of, in a way, like his top student. They eventually had something of a falling out. But Ouspensky wrote about meeting Gurdjieff, and he met Gurdjieff in 1915 in Moscow. So not too long before the start of this book. But Ouspensky was already a mystically minded person, even though Gurdjieff took it to another level. But it's not like Ouspensky came at it from total naif. He was already a seeker before he met Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff just kind of kicked it into overdrive. And for anybody who's interested, if you have not yet encountered this man Ouspensky, the author of this book, he wrote a book called In Search of the Miraculous that is just an amazing book. Even if you don't plan on studying Gurdjieff, the Fourth Way, or any of that, just the book on itself is fascinating. It's a really it's a good overview of the Fourth Way methods, of what the Gurdjieff circle was like, what that whole group was like, what life was like for them. It's a really fascinating book, and he makes some wild assertions in there. He at one point he says that Gurdjieff spoke to him telepathically. I haven't read the book in some time, but they were someplace doing their Fourth Way thing, and Ouspensky was getting frustrated. I believe it was because Gurdjieff, the Fourth Way was kind of was pretty demanding, and it's very much based on self-observation and improving yourself through self-observation. It's much more complicated than that, but this isn't a treatise on the Fourth Way. And Ouspensky was feeling a little disconnected from it. And so Ouspensky said that Gurdjieff spoke to him in his mind one night and told him, stick with me and I will show you the miracles that you are seeking. That's totally paraphrased. I haven't read the book in a long time. But anyway, the book's full of wild assertions about Gurdjieff's abilities. It's really interesting. But so he had already met Gurdjieff by the time of these events. But so Ouspensky wrote for a Russian newspaper. He wrote for them for many years. And he was writing for the paper and got stuck in Russia during the Russian Revolution, which broke out in 1917. And the Russian Revolution is what led to Soviet communism, is what led to the Soviet Union. You had the Bolsheviks. You had these various groups. There's really two groups. But again, I'm not trying to do an extensive treatise here. Just suffice it to say that this revolution was happening while Ouspensky was trapped in Russia. And it's fascinating because at the time, not only was he working for the newspaper, but he was working on two books. There was one book where the basic thesis of the book was that our consciousness is really just another form of sleep. Like our waking consciousness is just another form of sleep. And anybody who knows the Fourth Way will recognize that immediately because that was a central tenet of Gurdjieff's own teaching. But Ouspensky was also working on a book where the thesis was that three-dimensional universe does not sufficiently describe reality. Basically, that there's more than 3 dimensions. And the reason why I bring that up is I just want everybody to understand, if you're not familiar with Ouspensky, it's just interesting on its face that Ouspensky, this man with a very unique mind, he's a very esoterically minded person, very unique perspective. And he got to watch as the Bolsheviks tore through Russia, and as this thing took over Russia that would eventually become the horrors of Soviet communism. And he was looking at it through a lens that probably no other human being had, a very unique perspective. And he says a couple things in this book that I really want to discuss, because they're I think they could be very significant. I wanted to go into Ouspensky's background to explain why I think they're significant and why I don't just write them off. Ouspensky is not a man, in my opinion, to simply be written off. He was a brilliant man. He was a very sincere seeker. And he was connected to kind of like a network of mystics and esoterically minded people, however you feel about those. There are a lot of people who have negative feelings about them. However you feel about it, my point is, he wasn't just an average bystander, and so I find his perspective to be very interesting. And so, and there are a couple, there's a couple little observations that he had that I just wanted to quickly share, even though they don't directly relate to the meat of what I'm about to get into. But one is, on page 3 of the book, he says, "We are able to understand without difficulty that a nation is a creature standing on a far lower stage of development than individual men and women. It is about on the level of the zoophytes, slowly moving in one direction or the other and consuming one another." I find that very interesting, because intuitively, I would think of a nation, a town, a city, as a higher level, right? Like the human beings are the cells within this higher level organism. But that's not how Ouspensky viewed it. Ouspensky viewed it as a lower level organism, lower in comparison to individual human consciousness, which I thought that was very interesting. But also, so before I get into the real meat of this, and let me quickly say, the meat of this is that Ouspensky asserts that Soviet communism, well, what would become Soviet communism, was intentionally summoned like a force, like a primeval force, by certain German actors, in an effort to benefit the German side. You have to remember, this was during World War I, in that whole era. And so, yeah, that's what I'm about to get to. I don't want to keep you hanging too long, so I want to throw that in there. But there are also interesting things that he said. And another one is, and this one is really odd to me. So he talks about the law of opposite aims and results, which he capitalizes, which implies to me that he perceived it as an actual law of reality. He wasn't talking in a generalization, he was talking about an actual natural law. And I do want to look that up and see if that was ever expounded on by either Ouspensky or somebody else in the Fourth Way. I find that very interesting. But if we begin in what is left of Russia today to examine this life of the great forces, we observe primarily that everything in it acts according to one general rule, which I may call the law of opposite aims and results. In other words, everything leads to results that are contrary to what people intend to bring about and towards which they strive. That's very interesting, because the picture that Ouspensky paints, he talks about how the people on the outside, they see this as this like political battle. But Ouspensky, his whole account from the inside, he said that's not what happened. He speaks of it more as like a psychic deluge of just kind of madness that overtook everybody, even beyond mass hysteria. It goes beyond that. It was kind of like a collective psychosis. But also, he talks about how all the efforts that were made by the politicians, the intelligentsia, and just people in general, they kept having the reverse effect that was intended. So they would go to achieve goal X, and instead, goal Z would slap them in the face. And it was just like a overpowering force that was bending reality in this certain way. And I find that very interesting. I especially find it interesting because a lot of it really kind of makes me feel like what we're living in right now, in this period right now. And I'm not sure about that. I want to think about that more, but I think there are a lot of similarities. And I've been contemplating a lot lately the whole Pepe phenomenon from back, what was that, like the 2015 through 2016. I guess I can't go into that because unless you know what I'm talking about, you won't understand. But it's very interesting, man. It's very interesting, the parallels between what Ouspensky perceived and witnessed and what I am perceiving and witnessing right now, what I assume a lot of you are perceiving and witnessing. Very odd. But, so, the big point that I want to get to, and I'm getting to it right now. Ouspensky asserts that what would become the Soviet Communist Movement, which started as the Bolsheviks, was from its start a kind of spiritual weapon, right? And this is interesting to me because it makes me think of egregores. And if you're not familiar with egregores, Mark Stavish wrote a fantastic book on it. I read Stavish's book, and that book changed the way I thought about a lot of things. There are probably few books that have affected me more than Stavish's egregores. I highly recommend checking it out. A simplified way to explain an egregore is like a collective thought form. Whole bunch of people share a certain thought, a certain goal, a certain dream, whatever it is, a certain desired objective. And they all become caught in this kind of like a cocoon of consciousness, right? They all are living kind of intertwined psychically. And this egregore, this thought form, takes on a life of its own. And in some cases, I see different opinions of it and different perspectives of it. And I think there might be different variations of it even. But in some variations and in some perspectives, the egregore itself does begin to influence the people who created it through their collective thinking. And so the egregore is kind of guiding them as much as they're guiding the egregore. And I want to stress, Ouspensky never uses the term egregore, right? But that sounds to me like essentially what he is saying. And it's very interesting because he ties it to a specific unnamed German. There's just a sentence in here where he quickly says, "Behind these unexpected effects of a mise en scene, I think I can perceive the hand of an experienced German schemer." Now, maybe he was speaking in a generalization, saying that some German schemer. I don't know, it seems like he's implying a specific person that he knows, which is interesting. He never says the person's name, which that itself is interesting. Was he trying to protect himself? Like he didn't want to get caught spreading this? Who knows? This is pure conjecture on my part. All right, that part that I read is what Ouspensky actually wrote, but the rest of that was just me thought experimenting. But this part is very interesting. Such is the position at present. Unhappily, you do not realize what will happen if the Bolsheviks should gain a victory over Russia, or even if Bolshevism is allowed to remain for some time as a state, governing immense territories in Eastern Europe and Western Asia. The reason why you do not see the harm done to civilization by the rule of Bolshevism is undoubtedly the fact that you do not realize its true meaning. You mistake it for what it wishes to be mistaken for. Look at that. He's talking about it as a consciousness, like as its own thing, its own being. You mistake it for what it wishes to be mistaken for, but the essence of Bolshevism lies precisely in what it is not mistaken for. You think Bolshevism a political system that can be discussed, but whose existence cannot be denied. In reality, Bolshevism is not a political system at all. It's something very old, that at different times has borne different names. The Russian language of the 18th century knew a name, preserved until now, Pugachevshchina, which renders very well the essence of Bolshevism. Pugachev was a Ural Cossack who pretended to be the deceased Emperor Peter III, and who raised an insurrection against Catherine II, and for a time succeeded in seizing half of Russia. He plundered the estates of landowners, hanged their owners and priests, gave the land to the peasantry, etc. This sounds just like Bolsheviks, but it wasn't. It's earlier. A classical description of the Pugachevshchina is to be found in a novel by our poet Pushkin, A Captain's Daughter. I need to read that book. But Bolshevism of the 20th century has one peculiarity. It is made in Germany. He puts that in quotes. And Germany knows how to make use of it. Employing Bolshevism in 1917 to break up the Russian army, Germany destroyed the danger menacing her eastern front. You were in great peril, and you know it. But now you have decided that the peril is gone, and you are mistaken. Germany is not annihilated or even weakened. She is energetically and cleverly preparing a revanche. Her chief enemy is England, and the chief trump in her pack is Russian Bolshevism. Later in the book, he talks about how the Russian culture, the Russian mind, was uniquely susceptible to this force because they had kind of an inherent distrust of the intelligentsia, of just rulers, of landowners. Doesn't really expound too much on why that is. I know a bit about Russian history, so I can put it together. I don't like to put words into Ouspensky's mouth, but he does say that the Russians were particularly susceptible to being taken over by this force, and so so he is talking about this destructive force that wants to tear down all hierarchy. And of course, as we all know, in the end, there's always the characters in the shadows who swoop in and build that hierarchy right back up and put themselves on top, and all the useful idiots get thrown back in the gallows. We all know that. But still, on its face, it's a mistake to think that everybody was just cynically going along and saying, hey, we're going to do this, we're going to take power. That's not true. If you read about it, these people were consumed by this obsessive force. I'm talking about the Bolsheviks right now, but also apparently this Pugachevщина. But today we're seeing it. I mean, it's been periodically through the decades ever since. You have these socialist uprisings where these people become obsessed with. It's just this hateful, dark, destructive force that on its face is saying equality and beauty and love, blah, blah, blah. And it's like the same egregore. It's the same thing, like resurrecting over and over again, just in slightly different forms. And I know it's really, really fascinating stuff, and I want to dig into it more. The connection, the use of the occult by the communists has been written about in other places, and I definitely intend to read. I actually have read a little bit of it, but not enough that I'm going to try to say anything coherent about it right now. But this is definitely something that I just really want to get into, and I find this so interesting. I really, honestly, just wanted to share it. When I return to this, it will be with more research, more structured thinking, etc. But for right now, I just really wanted to throw this out there and get feedback and just hear how people think about it, because I just find it so interesting. Just thinking of this force being intentionally summoned, and then thinking of it like right now, because like theoretically, if this was possible, then any nation could use it to undermine an enemy nation. They might not even have any of these socialist ideals themselves, right? They could just use it as a destructive force in an enemy nation, which I think may actually be happening. But again, I'm just thought experiments, man. Just thinking. I'm not making any definitive assertions, no definitive claims. Just something I've been thinking about and looking around and observing and thinking, that this could possibly be true. Or there could be some kind of meat to this. And so let me also say, this is not without any kind of like historical evidence, because the German involvement, or German potential involvement with the Bolshevik Revolution has been talked about in the past. There's these things called these papers called the Sisson Papers, which were these papers that arose that made exactly this assertion that Germany was actually funding and fueling the entire Bolshevik Revolution, or Russian Revolution. The Sisson Papers were later determined, I would say claimed. I looked into it. I don't think it's fair to say determined, but were later claimed by a credible source to be forgeries. And the reason why I say that, the person, I can't remember his name right now, he was a very prominent American diplomat, an American political figure who made this assertion, and I cannot remember his name right now. But he seems like a legit person. After reading Blacklisted by History, it's a book about Joseph McCarthy, I've become very suspicious of everything coming out of every bit of scholarship in history coming out of the Cold War and World War II and anything associated with communists, because there's a lot of weird stuff that happened here in the United States, and that's its whole other story. Blacklisted by History is a phenomenal book. But anyway, I think I may be getting off that. But so you had the Sisson Papers, but even though those papers were determined, and the reason why I said I prefer the word claimed instead of determined, is because the evidence that the gentleman used, and it's really frustrating because he was an interesting man on his own self. But the evidence that he used to claim that they were forgeries, to me, wasn't really all that solid. Although his opinion was very qualified, and I assume it's true. I'm just saying I don't think it's fair to say it's 100% true, but I assume it is true because he was a credible person with proper background. But you have those Sisson papers. But even though his name was Capon, or it was started with a K, I think. But anyway, he did say though that even though these papers appeared to be forgeries, it was still completely possible, and there was still evidence suggesting that the Germans were funding this in some way. It's just the Sisson papers implied that the people involved in it, the Lenin and all those, that they were actual German agents. And the evidence for that is not so strong. But there definitely seems that there was German involvement in all of this. Whether or not that means they summoned an occult egregore, I don't know. That's what I want to look into. That's what I want to research. That's what I want to find out. And and that's what I'm going to do. So I hope everybody's doing well. I hope everybody has a great weekend. I hope everybody's having a great year. I plan on coming at you guys more with more research in this. I'm going to be going deeper into this and finding out more. I think it's fertile ground for some really fascinating stuff. But until then, peace out, everybody. I hope you're all doing well.